I'd like to invite Mr. Yuval ATSMON, who heads up the strategy practice in Greater China at McKinsey and Company. Yuval ATSMON, it's a pleasure to introduce you. Thank you very much. It's over here. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be talking to you about China today. Obviously, having been in China for about 5 years, I lost a little bit of my airline, but I've also had the opportunity to see the market growing very fast. And in fact, people keep asking if the forecasts about China are right. I've been hearing that for 5 years, and mostly, we keep being blamed for being conservative in hindsight. Having said that, and we can talk a little bit about that in the panel, China is obviously going through a lot of complexity and challenges that may impact some of the most bullish and pink forecasts. But I want to talk to you today about really the growth that has been happening and the growth that we are seeing in China. I think that clearly, the way I think about it, most of the messages I'll share today are actually mostly good news for the diamond business. They're good news partly because there is great demand for luxury goods as a whole, but it's also good news because luxury consumers in China are actually looking to consume more subtle, more, in some cases, more sophisticated, more fashionable way of expressing luxury. And in many ways, I do think that combined with their sense of value and classic items could be a big opportunity for even a faster growth for diamonds and several other luxury areas. But let me start from the overall luxury market and talk about just the total growth. Now, this is focused on the luxury goods. So it does not include cars, does not include spirits, focused on jewelry, watches, fashion brands. And as you can see, 1998, China was a very, very small luxury market. Within 10 years, it's actually emerged, a bit over 10 years, to be about 10% of global luxury demand. In fact, in watches, it's probably already 30–40% of global demand, and it's going to continue to take global share. We think by 2015, it will be about 20% of global share. It depends on what you believe, obviously, on growth in other markets. China itself growing at about 18% a year. When you look at why it's growing, we asked consumer, we had about 3,000 consumer conversations over wealthy consumer research targeted to understand luxury markets better over the last 2 years. And clearly, people have more money. In particular, the wealthy have been actually accumulating wealth faster than most of Chinese consumers. But generally, China has been growing very fast, and income has been, growth has been a big part of that. But there is also better knowledge of luxury goods. There is influence from their friends, from their peers, and there is a greater convenience in buying luxury goods as more and more brands have expanded. In fact, 2010, there's probably been hundreds of store opening in the luxury space. And you can see some of this growth by category. Watches continues to be, as I mentioned, the biggest category consumed in China. It's going to continue to grow fast, although jewelry, if you notice, is probably going to be the fastest growing, fueled by the fact that still penetration level is low. It's not a very common, especially not a day-to-day item for many Chinese consumer, but especially among the younger ones, and I'll talk a bit about age in luxury consumers, there's a greater spend on jewelry in particular. When you look at what is happening in terms of how people are spending more, and it varies quite a bit by category, but in particular in jewelry and watches, they're actually buying more expensive items. In some other categories, like ready-to-wear, they're actually buying more often. And it's worth thinking about this insatiable appetite that some Chinese consumers have to continuously buy the next most expensive, special, exclusive thing. The other thing is watches in particular, and jewelry, if you can see very little so, is a category that new consumer would get into. So when we ask consumer, only among those that have bought for the first time luxury goods in the last year, you can see watches was the most common, jewelry was least. And that talks to the fact that for many consumers, buying jewelry is something that they probably would buy after they've already consumed some other luxury categories. The other thing is to sort of look at tier 1 versus tier 2. Generally, Chinese consumers Now, we focused on those, so to speak, big 50 cities of Tier 1 and Tier 2. There's obviously hundreds of cities where demand is developing. But among those cities, interestingly, in the context of jewelry, many of them would not trust buy in the smaller cities. They would prefer to buy in the bigger cities where they can make sure they get guarantee for genuine product, and they also make sure they buy the latest products. So there's still a very, very big concern, which I think is a big driver in jewelry, big driver in diamond. I know, obviously, I've had the chance to talk over dinner about some of the certificates that are being made to manage some of that, but that's clearly a major concern for Chinese consumers. The other thing, just to deep dive a little bit in jewelry and closer to diamonds, look at the success of different brands. I don't know if some of you might have seen, in particular, Chow Tai Fook was very much in the news this week. They're talking about doing IPO in Hong Kong, raising a lot of money, $3 billion on very high valuation. They're very optimistic. They tell their entire story about China. They obviously are very focused on mainland China, 1,400 stores, 90% of them are in China, and they want to open 200 stores a year. Nonetheless, if you look at them, in Shanghai, they're not at all known by consumers. In some other cities like Beijing, Chengdu, Xiamen, they're actually quite significant. So there's quite a big variance between what brand Cartier, clearly the most successful in awareness, have managed to achieve in their status across different parts of China. We haven't researched diamonds in particular heavily in our research, but I thought it would be a shame to come here and not include some of the numbers in diamonds in China. You can see the growth, in particular in the last year, has actually been even faster in diamond, much faster than the overall industry of luxury goods. It's still small in comparison to the entire luxury consumption, but there is a reason why it's growing fast, and I'll talk a bit more about the consumer trends, and I think that will become more obvious. But in diamond specific, when we did some interviews in preparation for today, the three things that came out very strong from our consumers in China that we talked to, first of all, many of them are very aware of the campaign that has been going on, Everlasting Love, that has in China been quite aggressively promoted, and it managed to connect, especially around the occasions, obviously, of engagement rings as something that is more relevant, particularly for younger people. Likewise, this sort of sense that, especially compared to gold and jade, which are the most traditional jewelry bought in China, that it's more fashionable, more trendy. And then finally, interestingly enough, the idea of value preservation, and we'll talk more about value, where diamond seems to have, gold clearly is a big part of that in China, its success, but diamonds are seen as, and again, opportunity to get promoted even more so, items that have a lasting value. Going back to what's going to drive the Chinese consumer growth going forward, and this is probably the most complicated chart. I'm happy it's a big screen I'm going to show you today. You can see on the left side the population mix. This is focusing on urban China, so you've got 220 million urban households today. Another 50 million will be migrating to cities by 2015. And you can see there is going to be a double in the share of the most wealthy income bracket. But where you see a major shift is the next one, what we call sometimes the upper middle class. Those are consumers that are making a little bit more than probably 10,000, 11,000 euro to 21,000, 22,000 euro a year. They're not wealthy, but in what you see in China, their level of discretionary spending, their ability to afford more items, including luxury goods for some of them, is increasing very, very fast. And that's a consumer that is going to be extremely significant for the luxury. It's going to double its share in luxury consumption over the next 5 years. And it's posing some new challenges for luxury brands that might have focused only on the very wealthy. But now they have to deal with 50, 60, 70 million new consumers, in fact, new households of consumers that are going to maybe buy once in a while, but are collectively going to be very important consumer segment.